Hey everyone, my name is Ankit, and I'm one of the founders and the CTO at a company called Postman. And we are big Sailscasts users. We've been using Sales pretty much since late 2014. In fact, we run, I think, more than 30 different microservices on Sales right now. And it was, if I look back, it was pretty much one of the first big technical decisions that we had taken right after we had started out as a company. And I'm really excited to be here at this amazing conference and talk about Postman's journey as a product and as a company. And what I'll do is I'll talk about some of our stories getting to this point, what we learned in the process in our journey, and how we continue to learn. So I've been associated with Postman since the very beginning. The first version of Postman was written by my co-founder and our CEO, Abhinav, and I started contributing to one of the earliest versions of the product. So as a company, we formalized and incorporated in October of 2014, but the product has been around since April of 2012. And I'm, of course, as you can imagine, extremely passionate about APIs and the role that they play in the modern global economy. So you'll find that our story is closely tied to the evolution of APIs and how they have taken center stage in modern software. So Postman is now used by more than 15 million users in more than 500,000 organizations around the world, pretty much almost every single country. And it is also one of the largest active developer communities. And we have a very unique vantage point thanks to our community, as well as the scale at which we are operating. More than 700 million API requests are sent through Postman every month. More than 200,000 public API documentations are published on Postman. And we have about 100,000 instances of our Run in Postman button that is embedded across multiple API portals in the world. And Postman is at this heart of this API-driven transformation that is happening in the world of software today. And if you think about it, right, like there's a lot of trends that are happening in the ecosystem driving this transformation. You see the emergence and the prominence of public cloud offerings from, of course, providers like AWS, Microsoft, Google, and others, which allows more APIs to get created very, very quickly. We see the proliferation of microservices architecture, which means more applications, smaller code interacting with each other through APIs. You find on the far end of the decomposition spectrum, you have serverless technologies that themselves have found a ton of interesting use cases. And of course, the whole evolution with SaaS companies and how they're going public at massive valuations. And at Postman, we believe that APIs are the building block for all modern software. And the thinking around APIs itself has evolved considerably. APIs are no longer considered just a tool for developers or the wrappers around code. APIs are products, APIs are businesses, and it affects the spectrum of who consumes APIs. And if you look at companies like Stripe and Twilio, the products that they sell and the business model is actually centered around the API. And subsequently, you see leadership teams, business teams knowing more about and consuming APIs because APIs allow them to focus on their core competence while structurally, programmatically outsourcing the rest. And in a way, APIs form these networks that get created between the technical people and business relationships. And we actually, because of a unique vantage point, we did visualize thousands of such relationships on the Postman ecosystem. You see teams collaborating around APIs within an organization. You see multiple teams within an organization collaborating with each other. And you also see multiple organizations consuming APIs provided by other organizations. And interestingly, though, when we went and talked to teams and customers about how they believe they go from design to production with their APIs, we realized that they didn't realize that these networks existed. And these networks invariably end up being extremely powerful and they enable work to be done. However, there are several challenges when you don't know about them. In fact, we found a lot of teams that are not structured to map these networks to clear processes. And I think that often leads to these kind of issues in production. You have bugs in production code, you have productivity losses that happen due to a lack of clear communication, security lapses that happen on the surface area of the API itself. governance issues that come up around the design and the architecture of your APIs. You have different broken kind of workflows that exist between downtimes, invariably also leading to downtimes when you deploy newer versions of your API to production. And what we have realized over the last 8 to 9 years of us operating in the ecosystem is that these are not just technology problems; they are fundamentally problems of collaboration across the expanding spectrum of consumer personas that are interacting with and subsequently have their jobs depend on these APIs. So we evolved Postman from a REST client that a lot of you would be familiar with to become an API first development platform, which is centered around this notion of collaboration. And we've been hard at work at making this a comprehensive platform where you can reason about your APIs as the products that they are. Or rephrasing it in other words, a collaborative platform for modern software where development begins with an API. And we have fundamentally seen massive adoption of Postman over the years with users subscribing to this philosophy that we've been both observing, productizing, and evangelizing. We have hundreds of thousands of teams now who collaborate on Postman, creating tens of millions of APIs. So that comes to the crux of this discussion. Where did this all begin and how did this all come together? So let's go back a little bit in time, about 12 years ago. So I started my career at Yahoo as a developer 10 years ago in Bangalore in India. And this is where I met my co-founder and our CEO, Abhinav. So at Yahoo, we were working on this front-end application, which was talking to a bunch of APIs. And we had to constantly figure out what the API was, whether it was up to date, and whether it was working or not. We didn't necessarily have any documentation to go with the API, as the APIs itself were internal and invariably changing every day. And it meant that we had to regularly go to our manager's desk and figure things out for ourselves in terms of how to consume the API. And I'm pretty sure some of you would know and feel this pain. And this invariably ended up wasting a lot of times for us. And sometimes would also break the build, which made people not very happy about the operations that we were doing there. And around us, we saw everybody using curl for debugging. API documentation itself was these curl commands in text files shared over Yahoo Messenger back in the day. Curl itself was hard for us to use because the first time we did like man curl on our terminal, this is what popped up, and I think this has scared me a little bit because it just seemed like a lot to process and understand. And this bothers it quite a bit because even back in the day in our nascent stage of our careers, we realized that for something as critical as APIs, because they were enabling a lot within our team and within other teams within the organization, we were still using tools to build and manage those APIs that were pretty hard to use. And the workflows itself seemed pretty choppy and ad hoc. And the only way this whole thing could work together is if everybody sat next to everybody else that they worked with, and we could just hop over to somebody's desk and ask them questions about the API and what changes were going in. And one holiday itself sometimes meant that we were often stuck. So we wondered back then and over a few years is, why wasn't there a simple sort of like an interface to help with this? Why do we have to rely on a command line interface that was built for, a different world and built a while ago? And this was one experience that continued across companies of different sizes as we went further in our careers. So to scratch this itch, we did what, every lazy developer does and build a side project. And that is how the first version of Postman came about in 2012. This is actually a screenshot from one of the earliest versions of Postman. And our earlier users, and this surprisingly a good number of them that I end up interacting with, remember this as the time when Postman was blue. So we built this out, we shared it with people around us, the teams that we were working with, and we saw their experience with APIs noticeably improving. We saw that for them, building APIs and using APIs become easier, and encouraged by that, we simply just put it up on the Chrome web store. And that took off like crazy. We saw developers recommending to others and presenting it in conferences. This is in fact a screenshot of the original Stack Overflow answer where Postman made its first public appearance. And for a long time, Abhinav, who had made this post back in 2012, was actually much more excited about his Stack Overflow ranking going up because of this answer rather than Postman itself. And our community was growing insanely back then. We learned so much about HTTP, about REST, about APIs from the community, from the questions that people were asking and the feature requests that came into being. And we very quickly grew from zero to more than 500,000 users all across the world. And I took this screenshot when we first started Google Analytics to Postman in 2013, if I remember correctly. And we just let it run for a couple of months. And it was really exciting and honestly surprising to see so much usage so early on spread all around the world for something that we had built out. And we were, of course, not even a real company yet. We were working out of an apartment, pretty much with desks side by side, being in the same area around it. But amidst all of this excitement in terms of this growing number of users, companies using it, and evangelizing it, and so on, there was figuring out how to survive ended up being a very real concern. In fact, we had this one sheet, this Google sheet that was created back in the day, very morbidly titled "Make Money," just figuring out like different avenues in which we could figure out how to survive. And we had the local ecosystem where we were seeking this feedback. And it always somehow bordered on the lines of, oh, it's Postman, I can build this over a weekend. But in parallel, Postman itself continued growing like crazy. There were tons of feature requests and ideas for improvements. Postman itself was still a free product back then, and as we found out that it was actually making an impact in large development teams. In fact, very interestingly, around the time when we were figuring out that sustenance thing that I just spoke about, we had this large team from the US sent us $500 because, and it was accompanied with a little note, almost apologetic, saying that we love this product and we have a bunch of software that we pay for, but nothing makes us as productive or as useful as this little utility does, right? And I know this is not a lot, but it is. But we love Postman. And we just want to make sure the development continues. And this was very, very heartening for us because we were still figuring out what we have to do with the product itself back then. And so encouraged by the signals that we were seeing, we actually started building out this new set of capabilities within Postman at this point in time. It was back then it was called Jetpacks. So Jetpacks was very, very novel in the ecosystem because it allowed, and it was one of the first applications which allowed you to write these integration and other kind of tests for your APIs from outside of your code. And we just, what we did was we packaged these capabilities as a one-time in-app purchase for our users to play around with. And what we realized was that people wanted to buy a lot of Jetpacks. But what was more interesting was that people wanted to buy Jetpacks in groups, usually as teams of 8 or 10 or 5 people together. And for us, that was really interesting to see and sort of like figure out what was happening, because we had this product which was being consumed individually and for whom the licenses itself were sold individually. But we had teams reaching out who wanted to buy multiple licenses for the product. And we kind of like had to answer these questions, right? Like, okay, is the entire team buying? Just a part of the team is buying the product? Is it the development team? Is it the testing team? What are they doing? What their workflow looks like? And that actually brought us back to the drawing board a little bit, where we decided to use this learnings and with all the validation that we had seen till this point in time, we decided to solve the fundamental problem of collaboration that we ourselves had faced at Yahoo and later. And even though Postman was being used for multiple use cases, we just wanted to make sure that we solve this problem because it was something that was, we were seeing signals of people actually approaching the product from the perspective of purchasing it as groups. So we launched this beta version of what we back then used to call as the Postman Team Library, which was a product that allowed you to collaboratively build and manage your APIs. And we actually got this to from starting of development to beta very quickly. And we ran this product in a public, private starting and then a public beta for almost 6 to 8 months with some clearly defined questions of that we wanted to get the answers to, and to be able to build a business model around it at that point in time. And with the validation that we started seeing from the collaboration product, from the Postman team library, and the growing number of users, back in 2014, we started out as a company and very quickly grew to become one of the more prominent API-focused companies in the world. And interestingly enough, now let's talk a little bit more about our involvement with Sales.js. So when we were figuring out how to build out this collaboration platform, I was just exploring what frameworks we'd use, what is the right sort of technologies that we use to build out this platform, because we did want to keep this whole experience real time, so that our users are able to build their APIs and simplify it as much as possible. And that's when I came across Sales.js, which was one of the most popular Node.js framework. And in this sort of hope of making our application real time, Sales came with this inbuilt kind of, I would always imagine, like a fairly nuanced approach towards WebSockets. And I have personally always found this out of the box mapping that Sales does of these RESTful API endpoints to equivalent WebSocket calls very interesting and useful. And it's come in really, really handy over the years. At this point in time now, if I talk about Postman in 2021, we actually support more than 1 million concurrent WebSocket connections on Postman at any point in time. And because we had this capability that came in from Sales for this out-of-the-box mapping, we were subsequently, with the amount of scale that we were seeing, we were able to seamlessly extract out our WebSocket connections to a dedicated proxy without much change to our backend APIs, because our backend APIs were built to be RESTful, and Sales provided that WebSocket layer on top. Interestingly, now a large majority of our traffic continues to pass through our Sales-based microservices. We have internally built a huge library of Sales hooks that allows new developers to build out production level code quickly, effectively, and at the scale at which we are operating. And just as a quick side note, so when I was browsing Sales and just evaluating the different frameworks and just looking at the documentation pages back in 2014, the Sales documentation itself was littered with examples from Postman. And that I thought was really fascinating. And so I took the logical step of reaching out directly to Mike, who was, of course, as you know, the creator of Sales on Twitter. And I think that was a really, really great engagement. And I'm glad I did reach out to him, because Mike has been super supportive of our journey from the very beginning. Even in our early days, he met us multiple times over video and even in person. And his team was around to accommodate a bunch of features and pull requests from us. And I think we still actually have an active fork of Waterline that we use within Postman. And Sales.js, I think, has been a big part of our ability to iterate quickly. When we remember, I mentioned about the beta of the collaboration platform. So we built out that first version of that beta actually in under 3 months after we started company, with like 2 developers, including myself, while we worked on it. And we took something that immediately started from 0 but had to scale to 500,000 developers. And I think Sales was a big part of our ability to actually get to that point and to build this out that quickly and to be able to support the scale. And definitely, I have really, really liked the way the WebSockets are handled in this framework. So Postman itself, coming back to our story. So Postman itself has typically comes under a category of companies called as business to developer, or B2D companies. This is not a term that I knew early on when we were starting out Postman, but something that we learned over the years. So business to developer companies typically have this fairly similar starting stories. So you have companies that are usually starting out as small development projects, sometimes built open source, built to service your own needs, and they start gaining momentum because they start growing similar to your traditional and pure consumer companies. The traction itself comes through word of mouth marketing, forums, conferences, and that eventually leads to this generation of momentum that catapults into companies building out the revenue structure. And you see some really good examples around GitHub, Twilio, Stripe as these B2D companies. And I think even from our perspective, we saw a very, very similar journey for us. And it was always good to see this sort of mapped in the ecosystem. So what I want to talk about a little bit now is some of the learnings that I would retrospectively attribute to our growth over the years. So the first factor, and something that was very essential, was that Postman as a product was a product of need. It was a product built, to satiate our own need with respect to the APIs that we were interacting with. It was built by developers for developers. It was even discovered and evangelized by passionate, like-minded developers, and it basically grew organically through word of mouth. The second aspect, I think, that led to the rise of and the growth of Postman itself was the focus on the product. Like, I feel very strongly that simplicity in a product is a feature, even and especially when you're impacting increasingly complex use cases. And before Postman, having a great user experience for a developer tool was almost unheard of. And I think for us, just having that innate and insane amount of focus in terms of making sure that the product is designed keeping in mind who the consumers are, why are they facing problems, with this notion, jobs to be done as a framework encapsulates it very well, which is to make better users, not better products. And because we continued focusing on the notion of simplicity, people found it easy to use, simpler than the way that they were building APIs, and that led to the adoption and the growth of Postman. We did have virality that was built into the product through the notion of Postman collections. But what was more interesting is it was not virality for the sake of virality. It was fundamentally a natural progression for the product, because as I mentioned earlier, and I'm sure a lot of you realize, is APIs are fundamentally collaborative. APIs allows people within teams to collaborate with each other, teams to collaborate with each other, organizations to collaborate with each other, systems to collaborate with each other. And fundamentally meant that through Postman collections and making those entities shareable and distributable, we were able to naturally bring in the virality into the product itself. And by not forcing it, but actually making this a natural progression, we were able to see this growth in terms of the Postman collection format, which is actually incidentally now the most popular API documentation format in the world. There are more than 75 million collections that exist on the Postman cloud. One factor that I would attribute to Postman's growth has been advocacy, whether it's advocacy by individuals who go and talk about Postman, whether it's advocacy by influencers. I mean, I think this tweet from Colin on the top right here is actually one of my favorite days from very early on, where we learned that NASA uses a bunch of Postman, which is amazing. And you see people from Microsoft, from Box, from NASA here, just talking about how much they love Postman. And we saw a lot of this advocacy happen with the product from very early days. And finally, just making sure that we were focusing on this advocacy through affiliation by strategically building strong relationships with organizations and simultaneously making sure that we also productized parts of it so that people would be able to evangelize the product invariably by actually providing value for their own customers. And something that really helps us in terms of promoting this advocacy for the product that we built was this notion of having this innate amount of focus on the critics of our product and making sure that we are passing them through this almost like a funnel of critics to admirers to advocates. Because we have been very, very focused in terms of listening to our users, understanding the problems that they're facing, whether it's in the ecosystem, whether it's with the Postman product, and making sure that we especially pay attention to anybody who is critical and eventually convert them into advocates. And early on, we were able to create such staunch advocates by using this approach within organizations like Box, Microsoft, and eBay. And that created this bottom-up approach towards adoption for Postman, which now makes it significantly easier to market, top-down to CXOs and VPs and organizations, because the end consumers of the product are already convinced in terms of utilizing it. And that is only possible when you focus on excellent, customer support. And whether it was like half a developer, Abhinav, at the beginning when we were running this as a side project, or when it was 3 founders or a team of 100 plus people, right? And this good support that we offered fostered that loyalty, induced the conversions, and invariably our customers and users have been our greatest source of ideas, whether it's on GitHub, Twitter, or email channels. And what we fundamentally do, and the way that we even approach functions like customer success, is basically that when you have a consumer, your objective as an organization is to help them succeed at their job, not just at using your product. And finally, I think one very, very key factor that is attributed to the growth is the ability to create continuous impact, the ability to execute very quickly and go to market, very, very quickly. And I think last year we actually released 24 versions of Postman, 2 versions a month. We closed a bunch of feature requests, closed almost 1,000 bugs, which of course shows in the way that our users perceive us on platforms like SnapShare and G2. So that's our story. I think it's been a fascinating journey over the last almost 7 years now or so. And in fact, if I go back to the early version of the product, almost 10 years now. So it's been an absolute pleasure being here, and I hope you guys learn a lot as a part of this conference and enjoy it. Stay safe, everyone, and thank you. Thanks to the Sailscasts team for having me here.